Hey, this is Tom from SarkyCode.com, and I want to go over some of the factors that determine what radius you use for frequency separation when you're trying to do some skin smoothing. And I'm going to start with the older picture of myself because I have we're talking about flaws in people's skin, so I figure it's just safer to use mine than anyone else. You can see in this picture there's some redness around the face, a little bit too shiny on the nose and whatnot. We're going to use high frequency separation to deal with that. And if you're not familiar with the process, I'm just going to go quick overview. What you basically need to do is create 2 copies of your image, and just group these together. And we're going to call one low frequency, and this is basically going to be the color layer. The other one is high frequency, and I guess you can call it texture and color. But what we start out doing is we want to blur the bottom image, the low frequency image. And the whole topic of this video is what values we determine to blur that. If we, blur it none, there isn't much going on here, right? Basically the same. Blur a little bit. We see a little bit of blurring going on, but how do we determine how much to blur? And it's going to change depending on the image based on how big the skin is in the picture that you want to blur. Do you have a high resolution image, a low resolution image? Is a person way in the background? Is it a headshot or somewhere in between? And generally, the smaller the person is, the lower the radius you'll use. The bigger they are, like in a headshot, the higher the radius you'll use. And in general, you want to blur it to the point where you start losing some of the details you want to keep, like the skin texture, the stubble, the lines. You still see, like, you can make out there's an eye, there's a mouth, there's a nose, there's an ear. You obviously want to be able to tell all that. And you still see the items you want to remove, like the blotchiness in the skin. So we're going to go with about 11 here. Looks about right. And then the next thing we'll do, we'll go to the high frequency layer, and we will go to image, apply image, and subtract layer LF, which is our low frequency layer, channel RGB, blending subtract 100% to 128. What we basically have here is pretty much almost a black and white image with the texture of the image, the hair, the lines in the skin, and then we go into the opacity, into the layer style, and we change it to linear light. And if we delete this group right here, or if we hide this group right here, you see there's no change between the underlying layer, which is our background, and this. So if we go and we delete, if we unhide the high frequency layer, we'll see the blurry image. So what this allows us to do is, now we can, say, grab a section of skin like where we have the blotchiness right here. Use the lasso tool with a little bit of a feather. Go into filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and oops, we want to be on the low frequency layer. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. We want to change that to about somewhere between 2 to 3 times what our initial radius was. So if we chose about 11, if we do maybe 28, you'll see that a lot of that redness disappears. Go a little more. We get most of it gone. And you see, by just swapping between the layer we changed and the layer we kept, there's a big difference in skin tone. And what we could also do is select more, and we want to be a little judicial about where we choose, and then just apply the same filter, Gaussian blur. And we want to be careful, and I'm doing this quickly just for the video, but what you want to be aware of is that you can get color bleed from dark areas like the glasses here. So you might want to change the selection there. You don't want to change the shape of the face too much, because when you blur some of the highlights and some of the shadows, it'll change the contours of the face. You don't want to do that too much. And in fact, for a portrait of a guy, this may even seem like too much to begin with. So you can change the opacity, just bring it down a hair a little bit, just so that it seems a little more. You want to change the opacity of the whole group. You can turn it off completely or bring it down a little bit, and that looks pretty natural. And what we're looking at is significantly reduce the blotchiness of the skin. Let me bring it back up to 100%, and just for a quick overview, some of the things we could do. If we're just looking at the color of the skin here, we could do is just, pick up a brush and just paint in a different color. And, we could set the brush style to color, and just change the color of different parts of the image. And the other thing we could do in the high frequency layer, that's where our texture is. So we can actually make changes to the skin. So if we go to our healing tool, go to the high frequency layer, make sure we sample the current layer only. A little wrinkle right here, we get rid of that. See if I want to get rid of some of these whiskers, I can do that. Just copy the texture from an area without hair, and then click the healing brush over a whisker, and then it's gone. You want to try to use sample different areas so that it looks normal. Anyway, so this is basically what you can do with high frequency separation. Notice as I'm changing stuff, like the color stays the same. So I could get the texture from here where the color is completely different, and the color stays the same in the background. We're just changing the texture. So if we look at that again, that's a big difference between the two. And if I took more time, obviously we'll get something that looks better. But the whole point is, how do we figure out what we want the radius to be? So I created a few different examples, and this is what it might look like if we selected a radius of 2. There's very little difference in the texture. What I did was I blurred it to radius of 2, and then I blurred that selection to about double what I blurred the radius to for the frequency separation. And you can see there isn't much of a difference here, and we do have blurriness in the texture. If we look at the texture right now, we just go to normal instead of, there's hardly anything in here. A lot of the texture is still in, we remove this, a lot of the texture is still in our blurred layer. And then we could clearly see whiskers and wrinkles and whatnot. So this isn't enough. And then it just looks like a blurry mess. If we try to blur it to the point where we blur out the skin textures, it just looks like we blurred the image pretty much. It doesn't look good at all. So we could keep trying that. 4 doesn't look much better. 6 is starting to look a little better. 8 is going pretty good, but it's still softening it a little too much for this particular picture. For a different style, like if it was a nude of a woman that you wanted a very glamour look to, you might go with that. You might go with like an 8. So let's look at what 8 looks like. And let's look at the blurred image. So we pretty much lost the major items that produce the texture, like a little bit of wrinkles, most of the whiskers, but we still retained a lot of the skin irregularities, and that's what we want, because this is what we're going to blur, and we blur that, and this is how we get the smoother looking skin tones, and then we put the texture on top. In fact, if we want to get it down even more, just duplicate that section and then blur it even more and see what that looks like. We could blur this quite a bit, and we still retain a decent amount of texture. So let's go to preview, and you can see the skin looks as a much more even skin tone, but again, for a male portrait, it's probably a little too much, and we'd want to change the opacity a little bit. Okay, let's delete that. And we can go to 10, and we'll look at 10 again. 10 is, we're going to see a lot more texture, a decent amount more texture in the texture layer and the high frequency layer. And if we look at the blurry layer, you know, it's at the point where we still see the defects that we want to remove, in this case, the blotchiness of the skin, but we still have the texture. So then we go in and we blur the skin. You see we lose a lot of that here. And if we go back in, and if there's a trouble spot, oops, duplicate that. We could blur this even more and just even out the skin tone even more. And again, we can use a paintbrush tool, set the colors, but we are losing some of the whiskers, and maybe that's what we want in this effect anyway. And again, if we want to reduce whiskers, or if there were blemishes, pimples, we could do that in the texture layer. And then you'd also want to remove the color in the low frequency layer. But let's just undo all that for now. So let's take a look. If we go to 10, turn off 10. Oops, turn off. I need to turn off 8 too. Okay, so if we go between 10 and our base layer, you see there's a lot more smoothness in the skin, and we could remove some of these defects. Normally, we're not really trying to change what a person looks like too much, but you don't stand and see some. This is actually one, not even full size. So this is at 100%. You don't stare at someone's face like this, you know, in a normal conversation with someone. So you don't see somebody's features and defects that closely. Plus, the camera, the lighting sometimes brings out certain features. So what we're trying to do is just minimize it so people look more like how we see them in real life, and, you know, obviously, and maybe a little better in some cases. But we're not doing too much, but we want to remove the bad things that the camera does. Now let's look at what happens if we go too far with the radius. So let's go up to 12. This doesn't look too bad. This looks kind of okay. If we go to 20, I mean, it looks okay, but we're not losing a lot of that texture, that skin color variation that we want to do. If we look at 40, for example, turn this to normal, you'll see that there's just way too much information in this texture layer, so that there's not much of a difference in the skin tone between the blurry and, you know, the low frequency layer and then the blurred low frequency layer. The only difference is we're getting color artifacts from adjacent areas, which we don't want. There's no skin defects in this layer to fix. Everything's in the texture layer, so we've gone too far. So that's not what we want. And the same thing, 20 is better. 12. So let's look at this. Let's look at 12. And 12 isn't too bad. We still have enough here in this layer to blur it out and get rid of the defects. And let's look at the texture layer. We have a lot of information in the texture layer, but we also have enough in the blurred layer that we could blur out defects and changes in color. Let's move this back to linear light. We could go back and, you know, blur this out, paint it out, remove texture, replace texture if we wanted, just like we did in the other examples. So basically what you want to look for is what we have here. We blur it to the point where we still see the defects we want to remove, but we don't see the things we want to keep, like the texture of the skin, the hair, and things of that nature. So that when we do blur it, we get rid of those defects right here. You'll see how there's some redness, and that evens out. And then when we put the texture back on top, we have a much more even skin tone. And then we could just go in there and be a little bit picky, remove things we want. If their blemishes, and it's basically how far you want to go. I think some people go way too far for my taste and just make skin look plasticky, but some people do it really well and they just get a really smooth looking skin. But people aren't perfect, and just my opinion, things shouldn't be completely perfect because people are real, and nothing wrong with seeing what people really look like in their pictures. But we do want to minimize just the harshness that certain types of lighting and cameras create, which you don't really see in real life, and that's what we're trying to fix. At least that's my methodology. So hopefully you understand now what the radius in frequency separation does and how to use more effectively when you're doing your skin smoothing. And I hope this was helpful. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Hopefully I'll be putting up more useful videos soon. Take care. I hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, please take a second to click the thumbs up button and check out some of my other videos on the right. To keep up with future videos on photography and photo editing, click on the subscribe button on the left. You can also follow my photography on Instagram and check out my site for more photography tips and equipment.